So we're live. I'm Joe Brooks, director and founder of Community Works Institute, and so pleased to have our guest Cole M. James from Otis College of Art and Design, one of our most amazing partners of all time, and all of their educators that I've had the pleasure to meet, and students too. That I've come in contact with are just totally awesome people. And I don't use that term lightly. And Cole M. James is here with us as our guest today on CWI's Spotlight Series. And we welcome you all. And I just want to briefly do my best to introduce Cole. Cole is an interdisciplinary artist and a teaching artist, I think it needs to be said. And for those who, are new to that term, it literally means what it says, that they are a teaching artist, they are a practicing artist, working in their own studio productions and various forms of media, and also teaching students. And Cole is an assistant professor at the Otis College of Art and Design here in Los Angeles. And Cole's work, and you're going to help us unpack this a little bit, Cole, I certainly hope, really uses a lot of figurative and abstract images and sound and scent. You can elaborate on that to amplify the subtle ways that perception can collapse and expand in time. And Cole also is an interdisciplinary artist who navigates the African Diaspora and circling the expanse of queerness and traveling through womanhood. So that's a lot of stuff to unpack, and we can do that as we go along in our conversation. But I also think it's worth noting that Cole's work is composed, in the way it manifests, of the intersections between digital production, whether that's video or some other form of digital production, and analog collections of lived experiences. So our topic today, nonlinear narratives and emotional math, might be a good way to start, because you introduced me to this notion of emotional math. That was a new term for me. Let's start with that, and then we'll unpack you and where you come from in life. Thanks for being here with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I think it started maybe like 4 or 5 years ago when I was asked to participate in a Makers Fest at the California African American Museum. And it was about storytelling, which is a big part of keeping community alive and thriving, is to share stories, to continue stories. But I was really, as an academic, understanding how sometimes the stories and how they're told in this very linear, fact-based way left out lots of information about the personal experience. So I created these books. They're expandable, collapsible books, and they're basically paper that can be connected and folded into a square that could be added together to create a chain or a form. And it was about the process of telling a narrative that became the nonlinear part, deciding whether or not the space would be occupied by a past or future narrative, and the form of the actual objects where you write in, the areas where you write, does not necessarily require or elicit a direct linear narrative. And I think that idea of narrative and nonlinear narrative came straight to the surface of things when I made this video called Manchego. And the experience of that was it was a rough time getting out of college, getting out of grad school at the lowest part of the economic collapse, where there weren't jobs, there was no clear direction as to where I was going to be. And it was the second time that I was facing being unhoused. And I remember having that in my space of like, I'm going to have all of these jobs in the fall as an adjunct professor, but right now I have no money, no job, and my rent is due. And I had like a little chunk of change to get something to eat, which I was very grateful for. And so I went to the store, the closest grocery store to me, and I saw this little box, and it, you know, in the grocery store, and it had manchego cheese. And I was like sifting through to find the least expensive manchego cheese. And this other person came up behind me and just like picked up one and left. And I was thinking about how much emotional math I was doing to calculate what it would actually cost me to have this cheese versus this white guy can just like walk up and put it in his bag and not think twice about what this will actually cost him. And so I made a video about the emotional math and how things are added, and how that narrative of emotional math takes place simultaneously layered to like real time. However, I'm having to have that non-linear conversation about, if I buy this cheese today, what will it cost me in 2 weeks? How many events can I not go to? Where can I not go because I won't have gas money in order to buy this like really delicious, amazing cheese? How do I start to navigate that? Well, in the video, I talk a little bit about, well, if I buy this cheese, that means I can go to the 99-cent store and buy like 2 weeks worth of food for the price of this one little, you know, pound of cheese. I could eat for 3 weeks on really crappy food that's gonna like, you know, destroy my body anyway. So it was, and I was more interested in, I mean, yes, these things revealed things about class, things about race, things about poverty, things about being unhoused. But what really interested me is the way that I was thinking, and how the thinking that I was going through at that time, it wasn't linear. It wasn't like, well, if I don't get this cheese, I can have this money for this. It was like, if I get this cheese, I can also have a little bit of relief from this larger situation that is impacting me. And is that worth more than this other thing of just being sustaining, you know? And that kind of thinking, I realized it's something you go through when you are outside of a place of privilege, right? It's something you think about, that you measure, that you are taught at a very young age to navigate that space of emotional math. And it doesn't happen in a straight line, in a linear space. It is definitely multi-layered, where you're thinking about now, you're thinking about the past, you're thinking about the present. And that type of thinking it's part of responding to constructs, right? So what I also realized is that they're invisible narratives, so they don't have to be tied necessarily to the linear. And it's the experience in being in your body and having to kind of move through racist spaces, the cognitive practice of how to stay safe. And in this process, it's like you're taught to kind of suppress what they call your lizard brain. So this emotional math is navigating in and out of your lizard brain. So some people call it like the triune brain. It's that part of your brain that controls your flight or fight responses and all of those things. And there's like several books and things that I've been like really interested in thinking about the intersections of these. One includes My Grandmother's Hands by Erasma Menakem, Emergent Strategies by Adrian Brown, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmier. And then I also am really, really impacted and encouraged to read some of the writings of another really great thinker, Bayo Akomolafe. And Bayo is talking about the intersections of racial justice and climate justice. And something that I've learned about is like geopathic stressors, right? And so even though in my mind I'm having these like invisible narratives and this emotional math, that is also impacted by the geopathic stress that I'm experiencing by being in a space of concrete, right, that has also experienced a lot of trauma, like anywhere there's like sewage lines, anything under the earth, sites of that, which include being in a big city. And so when I think about that space of nonlinear narrative and where that intersects in education, I think what having a nonlinear narrative can be an opposition to cognitive imperialism, right? The cognitive imperialism that says, you know, this is how we move, this is how it's always been done, but allowing for a space to accept a nonlinear narrative, to accept that these stories happen simultaneously. Like the concept of colonization happens simultaneously to the pain and destruction that Indigenous people experience. Like those, it's not one or the other, they exist simultaneously together. And so that space of having a nonlinear narrative allows for those things to be there in that space. In regards to like my teaching, I'm always asking myself, like, how do I make the learning space inclusive and full of justice? And how do I do that facing racism and implicit bias from my colleagues and the students as well? So it's like, how do I make it inclusive while I'm also being oppressed by that same system that's oppressing all of us? And so I have these three spaces that I try to navigate in the classroom. And then that also is part of my like practice outside of the classroom. My classroom practice mirrors my studio practice. And so my three things is, the first is honor the space of the ancestors. The second is be okay with mistakes. And the third is always do not absorb racism. And so some of the ways I do that, like the first one of like honoring my ancestors, it's like I seek materials and knowledge from my own ancestral space, and I encourage everyone around me to do the same. I got to do a residency in Ojai with the Carolyn Glasso Bailey Foundation, and I had the honor of being able to hang out with a fantastic herbalist, Sade Musa. And one of the things that they said in our talk was, if your ancestors did not burn sage, don't burn sage. And I thought about the space of that, and I was like, that's amazing. I want to hear more of that. And others should also be searching out, what did your ancestors honor and hold true? And for some of us, that's easier. And for some of us, it's a little bit more digging. The second, be okay with mistakes. I always try to model accountability. When I mistakenly misgender, and notice I said when I mistakenly misgender or incorrectly pronounce a name, because I know it's going to happen, right? So every time that happens, I stop and I take responsibility. So being okay with making mistakes, and I model that for students so that they can also understand it's okay. In my studio practice, it's all about making mistakes. Sometimes I want to do things like data bending, and I don't know what it's going to turn out if I take this file of beautiful sound from a family reunion and, you know, spit it out as a visual. Like, I like the mistakes, so I absorb that in my studio practice. And the third thing on the list is do not absorb racism. I got a chance to work with Isabel Ludernot, who is now at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery. And I remember we were talking about our experiences, and the first thing that she told me that I still hold on to is like, don't internalize it. You cannot internalize it, because that's not the space where it exists. And so my counter to that is, even in the classroom and in my studio practice, to spend more time in healing spaces and spaces of joy. And sometimes that means letting go of the imperial structures of productivity, to stop and pause and do the invisible healing. And sometimes that means I shut my camera off on Zoom meetings. It means I mute myself in those meetings so I can actually react and respond without judgment. And I think when it comes to this time in Zoom, I greatly appreciate it, because the stress on my body from having to sit in a room experiencing racism and not being able to react to it, not being able to respond, also known as code switching, that I realized, especially in this time of COVID, how much my body was absorbing that space. And so it's been really liberating to not have to be in the room and still be able to have these conversations. Because it's a physical response, like I was talking about earlier, that lizard brain. So when a statement is made, like say someone comes out and makes a statement like, I don't need to talk about diversity in my classroom, my lizard brain immediately starts to fire, because I know that's simply not true, right? It's just simply not true. That's going to look different for other places, but that dismissal of equity in a space, it feels differently because I don't experience that colleague to colleague. What it does is it takes me right back to being a student, and I remember what that feels like as a student. I don't know how I ended up in education. I had a horrific time in high school. It was horrific. I had a horrific time in community college after high school. I had the most racist teachers one could have. I had some amazing, exceptional teachers, and they're the ones that kind of got me through. They include my mentor, who is no longer with me, who I still think about every single day, Brenda Kincaid, Deborah Avery. Those are the two, and Karen Lasser, that I had early on. And then, having teachers that allowed me to do things like, and this was in high school. I know we talked about like a K-12 group, so I wanted to talk a little bit. I hated high school. It was very, very rough, but I had some pocket teachers. My science teacher who let me draw all of my assignments, right? The art teacher who said, there's the cabinet, go play. Brenda Kincaid that I talked about, my dance teacher, who was the first to be like, you're an artist. Like, yeah, a lot of this stuff isn't going to make sense to you because you just think a little bit differently. Deborah Avery, who kind of got me into reading and understanding reading, and then putting opportunities for me to read things that were by people that look like me. Even in college, I never passed US history one time. And the reason why is because I literally believe that my teacher took a look around and said, what this class needs to read is different. And so she handed us Incidents in the Life of a Slave and a collection of firsthand documents. First time ever I had the slightest interest in US history. And it was literally because I saw myself reflected in the material. That was the only reason. So allowing for a space of that just to be recognized is a point of joy. To see myself in the material, even as an educator, when materials are given. I think sometimes when we do trainings and we talk about diversity, equity, we show a bunch of images that are not really reflective of the community that we're part of. And we make lots of assumptions, right? We make lots of assumptions about who we are. I remember when I first started working at Otis, I had a lot of students that were not from the US. And I realized very early that as an educator, I was going to have to learn. It took me right back to, this class I took in college, which was really silly at the time. I thought it was really silly, but now looking back, I'm like, that was a good idea. It was back in the early 2000s, late 90s. It was called Multicultural Communication. And it talked about different ways different cultures communicate, everything from eye contact to body language to, how loud or how low your voice is, where you stand, and being able to tap back into that knowledge so that my presence as an American was not a learning block to my students was really important during that time. So yeah, and then when I'm in the classroom, I think, because I've also been thinking about how as an educator do you build equity, especially if you're a person who doesn't feel comfortable having conversations about race. If you are a person and you do not feel comfortable talking about race, that does not mean that you do not talk about equity. that you do not allow for a space for equity. So some really basic things that I do specifically to build equity, to break down the hierarchy, is when I'm in the classroom, it's all about choice. So what I do is I give students lots of opportunities to make a decision about things that are taking place in a classroom. So I allow them to select the order of events. I literally say, we have a list of things to do today. What do you want to do first? What do you want to do second? I ask them to give me like, well, how much time do you want to spend on each one of these? I pause for their lizard brains as well to help them, you know, find the exits, like calm, like do not suppress your flight or fight, look for the exit, rock, shout, be silent, turn your camera off, get to the place where now we can have a conversation, and then let's make some decisions. Because even the act of making a decision, if you've never been asked as a student, right? Well, what do y'all want to do today? We have all these things. What do you want to do first? And they're like, the pressure of having to make that decision, but it's because we're not giving them time to practice that before they get to college. I always elicit feedback, like every single class, feedback, feedback, feedback. Did this work for you? What do you want to see more of? What didn't work for you? You know, do you want more time? Do you want less time? Feedback, 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 every class, to the point of like, we start and we end our days with feedback. And what this does is it gives space to be part of a partnership, right? Cognitive imperialism says, I'm like your authority parent figure and you need to do what I say, but then I'm going to cut you loose and then let you go fend for yourself in the world. And I'm thinking like, that doesn't really give them lots of opportunities to practice the things that they're going to need once they're gone. And so I allow them to self-select and to support each other, right? I take away, I'm the only one that can teach you something. No, I can teach you something, you can teach each other something, and we can teach our community something by being together. And I was always thinking, like, as I was thinking about this talk, I was like, well, what does that have to do with non-linear narratives? And I was like, well, it just makes space for them to exist. Just because things have been done the same way for so long doesn't mean that's the only way they can get done. Assimilation is not the only way of cohabitating. Sometimes when I think about, you know, educators have student learning outcomes, course learning outcomes, program learning outcomes, institutional learning outcomes, but it doesn't necessarily say we have to achieve those in the exact same way it's always been done. So I'm interested in breaking the cycles of cognitive imperialism. You know, imperialism, it says, well, these are the binaries. This is good, this is bad, this is superior, this is inferior. This is what it looks like to be hardworking. Like you gotta just go, go, go. And then doesn't say, well, if it doesn't look like that, it's lazy. This is what deserves attention. This is what doesn't deserve attention. And there's something about the binaries that do not support what we're doing. You know, my mom said something the other day, which I love. You know, we talk about everything. I'm very close to my family. And she said, you know, everybody's a little bit racist. Racism everywhere. Racism everywhere. Everybody's always been racist. And then it kind of took me back to the part of our brain that is racist, right? And then the structures that support how that part of your brain responds to each other. And it's like, well, how can I move through that as if it was just a learning block like any other learning block that I had, you know, with a student, whether it just be, you know, a language barrier, a cognitive barrier, auditory barrier, like any other, like, how do I just get through that learning barrier? How can I adjust as an educator? I think it's a misconception to expect students to learn a specific way that fits our teaching style. It's like, no. We need multiple teaching styles so that we can figure out how to teach everyone who's in the room. So I think at the top of my list would be like the deconstruction and reconstruction. Like first to deconstruct any, like the first part of deconstructing is exposing, like there's a problem here. There is a political, moral, or theoretical inadequacy. To quote Marie Batiste, there is an inadequacy because of colonialism, and that has fed into the way we teach and the way we see our students. So we acknowledge it. Next is to reconstruct, to create a new space, not to adapt an old one, to transform, to shift, and make a decision. So in that same article, she talks about the choice where education can either dominate or it can liberate. And then that kind of reminded me of like, I took a bunch of like early childhood education classes because I wanted to be a preschool teacher for a short time. So sorry, do you want me to pause? Is that what I'm
No.
confused. The chat is going on and I was like, wait.
No, my apologies. No, you've unpacked so much stuff here.
Yes.
Cool.
I get on a, because
No,
it's all connected,
no,
it's
fantastic, and it's deep, and it's large, and it's wide, and it just seems to me that it would be helpful for folks viewing this to be able to kind of go back and dig into some of this. And I have a host of questions, including your own background, which I want to keep digging into because I'm always interested in what a person's own educational experience was. So that's kind of a separate question. We can come back to that.
Yeah. So yeah, I can finish this one up and then I can talk background.
You're
I was just
talking about personal, as I understand it, you're talking about deeply personal connections to why one may or may not want to learn something. I mean, did I misunderstand that?
Yeah. And then the realizing that there's, the belief that, or we tell students, right? You're going to go, you get education to get a job, right? That's what we're telling them. But really it's not the actual thing that you learn that helps you get the job. It's all of the space in which you grow in all of the different ways you're allowed to in an educational space will help you be able to utilize your skills, right? And find your way. But
it's also, I mean, I don't know about you, but I have a 20-something college student too who, is questioning the nature of higher ed. We'll leave it at that. And I can't completely disagree with some of the things that they're saying, but I think it's a question of relevance. And it's a question of, okay, this is about more than a job. It's about like forming a life ahead of you. Did I get that?
Yeah, that's super close. And then just also recognizing that for people of color who don't have any other access, that might be a good option, right? Like college not as just a bettering of yourself, but college as a necessity to get out of your life situation. There was no talk, and then I'll jump into the background. There really wasn't a lot of talk. My college counselors were horrid when I was in high school. Basically,
where did you go to high school?
I went to high school in a town called, well, let's rewind. I was born in Chicago. My family did the exodus from the south to the north and then to the West Coast.
Okay.
We moved from Chicago because my dad said he wanted something different. So he and my mom moved from Chicago to LA, and they said, this is just like Chicago, so we're going to move outside of LA, and they moved to the Inland Empire. And at the time, the town that we moved wasn't even a town.
What was the town?
It was called Sunnymead, and then it became Moreno Valley. And then
Okay.
it got,
Oh, okay. Fairly out there in the
hmm,
inland empire. I understand.
and it was very rural.
Yep.
Lots of big open fields and lots of farm animals and places. Like, it was unincorporated at the time
Right.
we moved there. So I had a pretty consistent relationship with nature.
Yep.
And then it started to become developed.
Now we talked about this. You ran around in creeks when you were a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went camping in Idlewild and Big Bear and
Oh,
Arrowhead and
we share that, and it's a diminishing number of people that share the running around in creeks thing.
mhm. And that's really kind of it's so tied to why um it's so tied to why there is so much trauma on Black bodies, right?
Mhm.
That not being allowed to experience green spaces keeps you far from understanding Earth, right?
Right.
And it teaches you that the Earth does not also belong to you as well. Not belong as in you like possess it and you hold it, but that it is your space to also store it and guide and gain relief and release in. Uh, I think that having access to green space, in addition to being able to feed yourself, to feel safe in your neighborhood, to not experience state violence, these are things that impact. And so the concept of like, okay, I'll go to college, there's a possibility I could have a different experience. Now, my folks were no one in my family until like this summer. My sister got a degree. I'm really proud of her. But up until then, I was the only one in my family with a college degree. Um, and I didn't know how to navigate this space. I made horrible decisions. I have so much student debt. It's like I can't even think about it. Um, I can't even like. It's just there's just no possible way. You know, I could ever hope to pay for that, in total and be able to have any kind of life. Neither one of both my parents worked full time, but we didn't have enough money. Like, it was too much to get any help, but definitely not enough to have extra. There was never extra, ever. And sometimes there wasn't enough, but they still were generous and loving. And they just said, go to school. And I was like, what do I study? They're like, we don't know. Just go to school. So I did. I hated, like I said, I hated high school, but then I got to college and
Where
the,
did you go to college first?
the first place I went to was Riverside Community College.
Okay.
The Riverside campus, it was horrid and horrible, and I
Yep.
experienced a tremendous amount of racism that actually made me leave and
Right.
drop out for a little bit. And then I came back because they built a campus closer to me,
Yeah.
and that campus was filled with a different grouping of students, right?
Right.
And so I finished my time there, and then I transferred in. It was there that I had a statistics teacher that was really fantastic, and helped me get out of the community college.
Did you like math before the statistics teacher?
No,
Interesting.
not
Tell
at
me
all.
about that. Tell me about that.
I love math until you start talking about things that don't exist.
Right.
I love shapes. I love
Geometry.
yes, very much so. But as soon as you talk about imaginary, I kind of lose it. I like graphs and charts.
Yeah.
I'm really good at grafting and charts, and like those things excite me. But I also had teachers that were not sensitive to the
Right.
way that I experience things, or even the way that I process language. Right, as a auditory visual learner,
Well,
a written word does not
I
work the same for me as if someone says it and shows me an example of it.
I
Uh,
can express my sympathy because I was like the ultimate failed algebra, math, geometry student. I don't know. It just didn't speak to me until I wanted to build things later on in
Yeah.
my life. It had no relevance.
And so I was able to get out of the community college and then transfer. I went to Cal State San Bernardino
Okay.
because it was close. Like I didn't want to go far from my family because
Right.
I never knew. I had very little
Right.
experience. We didn't have money to go like send me someplace else to have a new experience. It was like, oh look, this is close to you.
And you're
Now that
building
doesn't
student,
mean that
you're
that
building
I
student
wouldn't
debt
still,
all,
yeah, I'm
all
building
down the line.
that, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't full of experience. So I think about
Right.
um, somebody introduced me to Kant really early in school, and they were, he talks all about experience, but he was like agoraphobe, right? He never went out, he never went anywhere. And I was like, what I thought about what I experienced, explained my experience the same way. And I was like, well, yeah, because in the city where I lived, nobody had money. It wasn't a place where there was like rich and poor. Like we all had about the same amount of nothing. So
Right.
we did a lot of bartering. My mom would like crochet blankets and then we would get eggs, or my dad would coach baseball to a kid whose family like had horses, and then I would get horseback riding lessons because they would barter, right? Like lessons for lessons. Or um, my mom was really fantastic about teaching me about the spirit of American ingenuity. And I say that because she was a human resource manager, and she would make it a point, and this was, before the laws were so intense, but she would make it a point to hire every single person that came on the line. So in a construction site, there's all the people on the line from all over everywhere, but she would make it a point to make sure to find work for everyone on the line. And it would be to the, and then she would also make it a point to be like, tell my friends. And remember us having this discussion about, if any of your friends want to work, they can come and I'll give them, they'll work a day. And I remember going with her, and you got to be on the line in the morning, and there'd be a line of people. Everyone in the line was an immigrant. And then I put the pieces together and I was like, and my mom would say, this is what you do when you have been given a position of power and someone comes to you and they need something from you, and they're here to support themselves, whatever, you make sure you open the door for every single one of them. And so my mom had this practice of this that I now appreciate, but at the time it was that she was just like, no, I hire everybody. And if the person can't lift things, then he comes, or they come, or she comes inside the office, I find another space for them. Everybody who comes here to work will work today. None of these families are going to go home without being able to feed and house themselves today. Everybody on this line. And I remember that practice.
Well,
uh,
your mom was your mom. We're inventing words here. Your mom was, because we talked about inventing words. Your mom was like an open dooring kind of person.
mhm.
She would see people and she would open doors,
She would
depending on what.
hire women with no skills and teach them everything they needed to know.
But she could see. That's a very special skill in my book. She could see special qualities in people.
Yeah.
And then she would open doors for them based on the special qualities that she saw. Right?
And I think she was also doing it because they were humans and she was human.
Yeah.
And so because of that, my house was always filled with people from all over,
Hmm.
right? Like it was always filled with food from all over the world. It was always filled with family that I wasn't related to, languages that I'd never heard before. Um, and so I didn't grow up in a space that was like all Black. I grew up in a space that was already all kinds of people from all over the world, you know, being able that's how I grew up. So when I got to LA, or when I got to academia, And I was like, what is wrong with y'all? Like, why are you in these pocket bubbles? None of us can fight the oppressor in siloed spaces. It was very like it was unsettling to me. Like my first 2 years in LA, I was like, I don't want to have to pick like what I do that night based on the group of friends that were coming out. Like I had grown up with this, so the fact that it didn't exist here in the ways that I was used to, like the benefits of growing up around a whole bunch of people that don't have anything is that everybody has a whole bunch of nothing, so you have no choice but to understand how to be together. I remember living on a block, and there were all kinds of different families that lived on the block, including like Confederate flag waving racist dude. And the people who developed the Inland Empire, there should be lots of investigations. But one specific thing is the house that my parents purchased, that my mom purchased with the help of the company she worked for. It was back in those days where the company would help, that doesn't happen. So they purchased the house with the help of my mom's job, and they built the house on deeded land. So we owned the house, or we were paying on the house, but not the land the house was built on. So in that fight, we had to fight the developers to fix it. And it didn't matter if you were a racist, if you were an immigrant, if you were a felon. It didn't matter. We all as a community needed to fight the developers as a unit, because none of us had the means to fight individually. So there were many times growing up where that was the only option, was we either unite and fix this, because we all will suffer because of this. We will lose this little chunk of what we have. And so I very much understood that that's kind of how you move through space. It's like, is this a time to get together and figure out how to support everyone? But I remember everyone constantly making the decision of what is best, like for the community, as opposed to what was best for the individual. And that concept of like what's best for me as an individual is a cognitive imperial space, right? Concepts of what's good for the entire community, those are indigenous principles, right? Those are principles that exist outside of colonialism. Colonialism says you obey because it's good for the community, right? Another way outside of that to deconstruct that and reconstruct something different, it's saying, let's start with, how do we meet the needs of the community first? What's good for all of us? What are things that we all value that we can share? And that might not be obedience. We got to see that a lot last night, in the fact that people who have established community, who have established, they've done something where they're like, okay, we don't have a place to stay. We are the unhoused. Let's build community. Let's build a structure for our community. And then we have state violence destroying that, right? So that's not good for the community, because what's good for the community is for people to have a place to lay their heads in the middle of a pandemic, instead of, it's good for the community to be able to take a walk in the park.
I'm guessing that you're
exhausting, right? To think about, you would rather, so say if you're the mayor, you would rather people be able to take a walk in the park than for the citizens of your city to have a safe place to stay in a pandemic.
So I'm guessing that, and we can move right along. I'm guessing that you're referring to the Echo Park. Yeah. And clear the homeless folks out of there. And, as you can imagine, I have my own strong feelings about that, and Eric Garcetti, and I don't think we want to go there.
No, but it's important to think about the invisible narratives of that space.
Well, yeah.
As being someone who, since I've moved to LA, and in my entire life, I've been unhoused twice.
Yep.
And
it's a real thing.
Both of those times, I was educated.
Yeah.
I had a degree.
Yeah.
Right? So when we think about people like adjunct professors and professors,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
I remember being told a story about, you can be a professor and you could like make a living. Um, and then I got to that space and I was like, I'm driving to 6 different universities, working 6 days a week, and I am still below the poverty line. And having that, so when we think about the unhoused, right?
Right.
These are working folk.
Yep.
These are folks with jobs that are just trying to do their jobs. Some of them are essential workers.
Well,
So when we think about the community, we think about reconstructing and deconstructing. If we continue in this way without recognizing, exposing these concepts, we cannot reconstruct a different space. Like the thing I love about Bayo Akomolafe and some of his writings is he talks about um, there are these modernist structures, right? Cognitive imperial, colonial structures. Why are we trying to fit ourselves in those spaces? Why don't we create new spaces to occupy? And so every part of what I'm trying to do within my practice, and especially with this new body of work that I'm working on, but even in the classroom, is how can I carve new spaces?
hmm
I'm not going to even try to fit it into some white man space. How can I create new spaces that are not dependent on that colonial spaces? Like how can I find equitable funding that supports? So, like one of the things I love to do is like if there's a service I need or something that I need to buy, I'm trying to first and foremost like making sure that I'm buying Black, supporting Black owned businesses, or if it's not a Black owned business, it's a sustainable space. Or if it's not a Black owned business or a sustainable space, it's like a buy one, give one space, right? I buy one, and if I buy one, someone else gets one for free. Like that kind of reciprocity, like creating a new way to do commerce, creating new ways, to kind of move through. And whenever I'm thinking about teaching, like for this, normally I show a bunch of images and artist after artist after artist. And there's this one concept I wanted the students to get, which was associative and transformative color. I teach color theory and design. And I said, well, I could show them a bunch of images, or I can just let them go watch their favorite film and look for the associative and transformative color within something they already love. Like I'm not fighting their desire to tune out and do something enjoyable. And I feel like that's a new space that I'm starting to carve out. It's like, why does this learning have to always be something they don't know or they haven't seen before? And why can't it be fun and be centered in what they're already interested in? Because I know that's what I do in my studio practice. Like it starts with what I'm interested in, right? Like right now, I'm interested in a dialogue between another invisible narrative, but a dialogue between Black people and trees. I spent some time, I made the decision to go visit my family, and that included a 6,000-mile drive to the East Coast and back. And we had to take the southern route because of the weather. And I remember in these southern spaces wanting to be in green space because it's like it's better because of COVID, you're outside, but also wanting to be in green space, and then looking up at trees and knowing the history and trying to come to terms with this thing I love, which is trees and nature. And the
All of it.
And I remember that is part of my collapsing narrative, because the first time I heard that song, I had no idea what it was about. I was very, very young. I had no idea what it was
Yeah.
about. All I knew is that I could not stop listening to it. And
Yeah.
it was like churning something so deep in me. And I'm a kid, right? I'm a kid. I
Yeah.
know, like I know, but
No, it's
I
heavy stuff.
know.
It's
I
very heavy.
know this song, and
Deeply
this
heavy.
song is having me look at the trees around me differently, and I don't know why, and what do these things mean? And then I went and on this trip took lots of pictures on,
Where did you go
Square,
geographically?
Birmingham,
Whoa,
right?
okay.
North Carolina, South Carolina, Atlanta,
Oh,
Mobile, Alabama,
Birmingham,
um,
Alabama? You went there?
Memphis.
Yep.
Like these are hot, these are really hot. And
So
of course, Texas, right? Texas.
strange fruit is like a very real thing down
And in some places it still is. So,
there. Yeah,
uh,
sure it is.
but having a conversation specifically, excluding, like, it's not a conversation of this is what took place here. It's a conversation about we need to heal this myself between me and the earth.
Right.
So instead of creating a space of like me like talking about whiteness, it's me talking about blackness and my connection and black people's connections to the earth.
Yeah.
Like, can we have a conversation without white people present? Can we have a conversation about our ties to the earth and land without it being centered in our oppression? Like, can we talk about how to heal that space? There's all kinds of research being done about, first of all, therapy, which is fantastic, but also nature therapy, therapy that's held outside, therapy that allows specifically people of color to connect to the land, right? To connect to the spaces that
So
hold, like Octavia said, it holds our dead, like our dead are in the trees. Like, how can
yeah,
we, and so it's expanding and collapsing this narrative for me that I started as a child, like starting to understand this, like, how do you process this? And where does it come? I recently discovered a hike that leads to like Nazi sympathizers. And I remember before I knew that, like walking this hike, being like, I'm super agitated. I'm so agitated by this hike and I love hiking. Why am I super agitated on this hike? And then like I did some more research into the space and I was like, geopathic trauma, geopathic stress, right? The geopathic, like we assume that we can damage the earth and poke at it and have wars and oppress, and that some of that doesn't seep into the dirt. But
eh,
science tells us it's all energy anyway. So that energy is still present. Our lizard brain is still inside of us. It is still,
yeah. And
taking in information, and it's been programmed generations ago, right?
and
Generations ago.
I think many of us have an understanding of the lizard brain, but can you unpack that just briefly?
Yeah, so at the base of our skull, we have like I said it earlier, but the I think it's called triune. I want to say triune, but I think it's triune brain. It's a part of your brain that it's been around a very long time.
Right.
In the
Evolution.
evolutions, it's part of
Evolution.
your, yeah, in the evolution space, like it's part of your vertebra, right? It's like at the top.
It's in
Uh,
there deep, really
in the
deep.
1960s, it was in a book that was called, Evolution and the Triune Brain, or Triune Brain and Evolution. But it's our lizard brain, right? It's the oldest part of our brain. And what that does is it controls like our flight or fight response. So if you touch a hot pot, you'll move before you think about moving, because it's like that's what tunes in. Now people are starting to find out that over time, that part of your brain evolves based on stimuli and information. So if you have a body that has just been descended from many years of oppression, that part of the lizard brain of that particular group has been adapting to the environment, which for us and for what I'm talking about is systemic racism, institutional oppression, and systemic racism. So you have many, many years of that oppression, but then you also have many, many years of being an oppressor, right? And so in that lizard brain, it's programmed to respond a specific way to environmental dangers, whether they're real or not. So if you don't think that that's impacting how you engage specifically in a classroom, you're greatly mistaken, and you've probably already done a lot of harm. So it's not even something that you can necessarily control. And that's why I'm always talking about we need to deconstruct it. You need to recognize it. So if your response to like someone saying, you're being racist, and your first response, or we need to incorporate more DEI, and your first response is from your lizard brain telling you this is a danger, it's problematic. Maybe you should look into that, right? Because that's literally what happens is like somebody mentions DEI and the lizard brain of white folks is like, I need to reject this. I'm in danger. It's like, okay, yes, your lizard brain believes itself to be in danger.
Or you know, or we need to check a box off, right?
Lizard brain. It's still lizard brain of like,
yeah.
Check it out.
We've got some boxes to check off here and take care of business and move on. And you're talking about it as something much deeper, and much more subterranean.
Yeah, like bias is part of how we exist as humans, right? Bias towards things that are bitter because sometimes they're poisonous, and things that are sweet because maybe they're not poison. Like they have its ties in biology, but you know, humans are so complex, like wildly simplistically complex. I know that doesn't make sense, but we make up stuff that doesn't exist and then we like live by it forever. That's the silliest thing to me. Like we made all of this up, we can unmake it, right? Unmake it. If there is not a construct called race or class, it's not going to stop my body functions from going, right? And I'm not saying that we don't acknowledge that we have a race class issue, but I'm saying we made all of this up, we can unmake it. However, that's not going to happen as long as the people in power look like the people who are in power. As long as we continue to kick communities out of public places so folks can take a walk, none of that's going to happen if we can't, in our classrooms, understand that we walk in with bias. Even if there are no Black students in your class, it doesn't automatically mean that you have not or did not make a mistake in regards to being full of equity, full of justice, full of inclusion. Nothing can change as long as you refuse to acknowledge that. And your students will be impacted. And they'll remember you, and not always for the reasons you want them to remember you.
I would wholeheartedly agree with you. And there's a gentleman that I'm very interested in, Hans Gadamer, and he was a German philosopher, I think, philosophiker, back in the 30s. And one of the things that intrigues me about him and our work with collaborative ethnography, which is a thing that we're very focused on with Community Works Institute, is his whole idea of perspective and bias. And he, unlike the modern age, he doesn't approach bias as a negative. It just is what it is. And that we all carry a bias. And a bias, according to Gadamer, was essentially what we bring to an equation. a situation and an experience. And we bring our experience to it. And it may be tainted by all sorts of racial stuff. It may be tainted by any number of things. But his point was that at some point, two people, let's just keep it simple, interact and they have their overlapping experience. And that somewhere in the middle of that, I'm not explaining it very clearly, probably, somewhere in the middle of that is where those 2 points come together. And I remain fascinated by that. But Cole, I cannot thank you enough for your time and the giving and sharing of your thoughts. You're so deeply wise, and no, really, and thanks for being with us for this CWI Spotlight session. And I can't thank you enough. I mean, you're an old soul. You know what I mean, right? That was a compliment.
Yep, I'll take it.